back then, how many people you guys were in the brand?
Well, we started with 14 people.
14.
Yeah. And
but I mean, the middle 70s, you wasn't.
No. And then we were probably up to about 300, 400.
Okay.
And then we moved to 1,000, and then we moved to a couple thousand or whatever.
That's pretty challenging, right?
I
mean,
sure.
I have 400 employees nowadays here, and I passed together with my business partner through all the way from 1 to 400, and each 50 that you add in the company changes everything, the way you create the product, the way you create the processes, the way people relate with each other. I mean, what are the main, if you could cherry picking some advices to the entrepreneurs that are hearing us in this podcast today, what are the main suggestions that you have to the CEOs when they are growing fast in people? What are the concerns that they have to do, and what are the things that you remember that you did back in the days in your face when it was to 50 to 400 that you think that the entrepreneurs should follow your lead in what you did?
Well, I don't know if I ever recommend anybody follow what I did, but I can tell you what we did. That's different. But the first thing is try and keep it simple.
Okay.
Because if you're trying to convey a message, the more complex it gets, the harder it is to remember. And the simple thing which I came up with, which we did, was, as I said, a brand is a DNA. Brand isn't a product. Brand isn't a label. Brand is all those things, but more than that. It's your DNA, what you stand for. So I distilled it down to 3 words. One word was quality, another one was disruption, and another one was triple bottom line. Equal commitment to people and the planet and the profit and whatever. And the idea was to talk about that and make sure it cut across every activity we had in the company. So when we were disruptive, it was not only product, but we were disruptive in our business model. We were omni-channel day one. We sold retail, we sold on catalog, later became e-commerce, and we also sold wholesale. People said you couldn't do that. You're competing against yourself or whatever. Said no.
It's challenge, right?
Yeah. And you're challenged, but the idea was to put all of those out there. We would do those words, and I won't bore you with all of the details associated with it, but the idea was to then develop stories around it, and then have those stories told to consumers, to employees, to vendors, to all the stakeholders that you have. In doing that, everybody comes up with a consistent view of what you are. And we would hold a meeting every 2 years. We called it long-range planning, but it was basically trying to set the course of the company for the next 5 years, but a heavy focus on the next 2 years. And we would do that. We're adding all these people, as you talked about, and each person coming on had some interpretation of who we were. And it may be right, may be wrong, but the idea is we had to level set everybody coming back to where we were. So we'd hold this meeting every couple of years. It was very boring to some people who've been around for a while. Say, why are we talking about qualitative things? Why are we talking about disruption or bottom line?
Because they heard that so many times, right?
But the new people needed to know the same thing other people did. And one of the key things which I did at the end of all of these was the same comment, which again, for the people who've been around was kind of boring, but for the people who hadn't been around was startling. And I said, okay, now that we've decided all of these things about what we stand for, we've got the numbers, we know sales and margins and whatever, but the more important things are what we stand for, what are qualitative things. So I said, now that we've all agreed on this, I hope that we're clear enough that some of you now leave. Because if you have a different view, we can't have you around here. We hired you not because anything other than we thought you were great. But if you have a different way to do business, that's fine, but you can't do that here. There's many ways to run a business, but any business can only run it one way. So it was coming back to, how do we get everybody level set? Some people left after that. Some people left and came back. But it was trying to get people with that same view, because otherwise you can go in this direction and that direction. And that doesn't mean that you aren't looking for new ideas and new inspiration that come from those people.
Of course.
You are, but when it comes down to the simple basics of what you stand for, you have to be consistent, persistent all the way along the line. And as an example of that, the North Face logo has only had one change since the beginning in 1968. And that one change is, in some applications, there's a rectangle put around the logo, because the logo is a little clunky in some application. Put it on the front of a store, you need something. So we put a geometric background around, and the geometry would work graphically and aesthetically. But we didn't want to change that. Now, the obverse of that, I believe, is just how Facebook and Google have really screwed it up. I mean, you got Meta, you got Alphabet. They've thrown away hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars of equity, response, belief from their customers to come up with something new. Now, they can argue, well, we were a product initially and we have to be another product. Well, maybe they should have thought about it at the outset. Or, candidly, couldn't you evolve that so it had a broader thing? The reality is the emotional bond that many of the people had to the company was broken. And now either they're going to have to spend a lot more money to do it, or they're going to see the passion dissipated, all of those things.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Can I say then, regarding what you're teaching here, that once you have your culture, you have basically a framework throughout the decisions which is going to be taken. And then you got to consistently tell what is this culture means to the new people, even though the old people in the company going to be bored to hear the same thing, but you got to keep yourself disciplined to tell the same thing over and over again to make sure that everyone understands what the company really is. Is that right?
Absolutely. And as you said, at times it can be a little repetitive to people that have been there before, but because they say we know it, whatever. It's actually, maybe they don't know. It's good to refresh.
Maybe
sometimes.
They say that they know, right?
Because you can be distracted by the newest China's object that ever shows up and look that way or directed, and you can see somebody having some success and say, why don't we, have you thought about doing it in that way? But you need to do that to be a brand, and that's what we want to be, because a brand is a value. Brand is a differentiator. Brand is what brings people back to you, and if not, it's very expensive. You want to bring the customer back because it costs 5 times as much to get a new customer as an old customer. So why not do that? On top of that, brand, which is registration around a logo or a tagline, is much more defensible than around a patent or around an idea or a concept, because you can do that around the globe. And so if you spend a lot of time and equity in developing it, if somebody tries to knock it off, you have easy legal recourse against them.
Yes, that makes sense.
And how to keep those old team members inspired on the long term? Because, we start to listen the same thing over and over again, but how to keep them motivated to do their work, to keep inspired and keep pressing on and doing awesome stuff during a long period?
Well, it's a great question, but I think the answer is we were very lucky. One of it is that our products and our activities and the expansion of categories we went into was naturally very exciting to those people. So it's the principles behind it that remained the same. But one, you change the tools that you're using to execute. So suddenly things come in, and more recently it's things like design thinking or agile software or lean startup management. But you have that sort of thing as you're approaching it. We would go into new areas. So we expanded from mountaineering into backpacking to skiing to trail running. We started getting those. That became interesting to a lot of people to be able to do it. So, so instead of just the philosophy being consistent and everything else being consistent, the daily activity was different. And then moving geographically, I mean, we were lucky because it was a slower time, as we talked about, and you could expand geographically, sort of sequentially. You didn't have to rush to it. Today, every company is born global. And so you have to register globally, and you're probably day one you're selling across international borders or whatever. But we sort of grew from West Coast to East Coast to North America and Europe and Japan and South America later on, and in doing that, every time we went into a new geographical area, that was pretty exciting to somebody, and we could do things about that. And then, as we talked about earlier, if you are around all these wacky people, whether it's the geniuses like Bucky Fuller, whether it's a guy rowing from the tip of South America to the Antarctic, or somebody who's climbing Mount Everest, being around those people is pretty exciting. And so it removes I wouldn't say dullness, but it removes the repetitive concern. And then the challenge is don't get lost in all of that. Let's go back to what we stand for.
Yeah, you know what? Well, back then, you didn't have the advent of internet. So it was pretty hard. I believe that was pretty hard to grow businesses as fast as you guys grow. Because nowadays, if I have a lot of money, let's say that I don't know, I had a fundraising and then somebody threw like hundreds of millions of dollars in my company, I can invest 50% of this in growth, like basically transferring this funding to Mark Zuckerberg and Larry Page and flood the world with my brand and create a huge pipeline of leads to my businesses, right? Back then, you didn't have this. You had radio, you had TV, which was too expensive for a new brand. Right. How did you manage to grow the brand without the money to invest in TV or radio or the things? What was the strategy behind the early days growth in North Face?
Well, first of all, it's harder now than when I started.
Do you think
the
so?
reason it's
because
harder
of the competition.
Because there's so much competition. We're just saturated with media. We're saturated with product and services. We're saturated with companies out there. We're saturated with global competition, and we try to do all of those things. You know, where are you on social media? You're on TikTok. You're on Amazon. You're on LinkedIn or whatever.
So many channels, right?
And you know, so getting it all together and being one company is difficult because we had so few channels. It was easier to be able to do that. What we relied on is going back to what I talked about in terms of that pyramid, and that is we used word of mouth. And we use word of mouth. And there's tools today that people should use called growth hacking. I don't know if you're familiar with that term, but basically it's how you can't afford to do maybe all the global work you're doing, so you try to hack into somebody's network. So you combine with somebody who is complementary to you, and you utilize that to be able to expand. That's sometimes influencers. This is the idea of doing that. If they have a million followers and their DNA is in accord with that, it works. But we would use people that other people followed. And then what we would do is be aware of, if we did these really exotic things, we could have put products on people that would end up in media. For example, there's a ski organization called Warren Miller, and they did these films every year. And because the people we were sponsoring were doing these crazy things, they were naturally in Warren Miller's thing. And all we had to do is provide gear to some of those people.
Really?
And they would show up in those. They'd be on the cover of magazines or whatever. So by being able to do that, and this is kind of the concept of growth hacking too, to be able to get paid media. We would do experiential things that became stories in and of themselves that then would be told by other people, and frankly had more credibility.
Yes.
You know, if I tell you something about North Face, you kind of think I'm a homie. Of course I'm going to say that.
Yeah,
sure.
When you tell somebody, you said, yeah, he was talking with Happ, he kind of does that.
As you did right on the beginning,
for
example.
It is.
Yeah.
But when it gets to the third person that you've told, it's almost a fact.
Yes.
You know, what I'm saying is there. I have a lot of credibility, and it isn't just me selling something, you know, because we're all sort of resistant to sales pitch. I mean, we hear them, we know it's a sales pitch, and what's the first thing you say in the store when people come in? Can I help you? The second thing you say is, no, I'm just looking.
Yes,
you
that's
know,
it.
Except the reason I'm in the store is I may want to buy something, but I don't want to be sold.
Yeah.
And so by using media or things that get out there, and we would come up with experiential events, either through the athletes we worked with or whatever. I mean, at one point, we sponsored a march across the United States where people were against the war effort, and we gave 1,000 tents away. And they marched the entire width of the country, which is pretty large. And all of these colorful tents showed up, and it was there. Well, there was media talking about that and what they were doing, and it didn't talk.
That was genius.
Yeah, and you know, we would do it in other things, you know, like Creedence Clearwater. We get involved in whatever they were doing to bring them in, and working with Buckminster Fuller, who has this whole strange following of people being out there. So we were looking experiential as a way of creating something that would then be newsworthy, so others would do that would expand on those channels that are out there.